Aboriginal Studies, Treaty 6. Treaty was signed on August 23, 1876 at Fort Carleton, and also signed on September 9, 1876 at Fort Pitt. Fort Carleton is located in Saskatchewan and was a trading post from 1810 to 1885. That was before and during the signing of Treaty 6. Treaty 6 land stretches from western Alberta through Saskatchewan and into Manitoba. First Nations people that were involved with Treaty 6 were the Cree, Saulta, Nakota, and Dene people. There was 50 different First Nations groups living in Treaty 6. A couple thousand First Nations met and performed pipe ceremonies during the treaty-making process. The pipe ceremony symbolized truth and fair play during treaty negotiation. However, during the treaty-making process, both groups struggled with language barriers. The Canadian government promised that if the First Nations people surrendered their land to the Crown would in exchange provide First Nations people with education, medical care, reserve lands, agriculture, assistance in times of famine, and the right to practice cultures and continue to practice their way of life. The terms the First Nations people had to obey were giving up their rights to owning the land. The First Nations people were forced into signing the treaties when they had run out of options. When the First Nations buffalo population started to deplete, they were forced to seek help from the government. Not only did the First Nations people seek help because of their main food source depleting, but also to help start a new way of life for their people. The First Nations people wanted to provide for the future generations, and with the promises the government made to them, that is what they thought signing the treaty would do, provide the future generations with a better life, one that included healthcare and an education. In 1883 and 1884, residential schools were opened in Saskatchewan. A residential school was opened in Battleford, which is in the Treaty 6 location. The government's goals of residential schools was to assimilate and civilize so that Indigenous people could coexist with Canadian society. The First Nations people did receive reserves, but not ones that were described to them. The First Nations people were marginalized. They were pushed to the edges of society. Sovereignty is superpower or authority. Treaty 6 provided First Nations people with their own type of self-government, which was, however, controlled by the Canadian government, but it did give them some power to self-govern themselves as a community. The First Nations people believed that they were sharing the land for the newcomers. The treaties provided a mutual benefit for both the First Nations people and the newcomers. The First Nations people thought they got healthcare, government help, and an education for their people. The medicine chest was thought to be a form of healthcare for the First Nations people. It was, however, just a box of medication that was kept in a home on a reserve. The reserve, however, was not anywhere near a hospital. The Canadian government had a different understanding of what this treaty had promised the First Nations people. Since the language barrier between the two groups was a problem, they tried to translate, but the First Nations people did not have the same words that translate directly to English and vice versa, which caused a lot of miscommunication and problems with the promises that were made between the two groups. There were many promises made between the First Nations people and the government. With the lack of communication, First Nations people were promised a lot more than what they received. The First Nations people believed in oral agreements, so there could have definitely been more promises made that were never mentioned on paper. Treaties started when the Royal Proclamation was introduced, stating that all land belonged to the First Nations people, and that if people wanted to live on that land, it must be purchased. Treaties are still used today. We still use treaties that were made many years ago. However, some people that do still live on reserves still receive an annual payment, which is not a lot,